Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is that you are, wherever you may be. Thank you very much for making us a part of your day. I am Brad Franklin, a creative content writer here in Chesterfield. I'm very glad to tell you that Chesterfield Behind the Mic is on the air once again. I am really excited about this show because, one of the things we get to do with this is we cover a lot of different topics throughout the county. We cover stuff on the county side, we cover stuff on the community side, and we don't really do a whole lot with the school side. So I'm really excited to have Ashley Hall from Communities and Schools here in the studio to talk a little bit about what they do. First, Ashley, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Hi, Brad. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate you being here and talking to us about what I think is a really interesting, not just in terms of like the work you guys do, which is incredible, but also to the structure and the uniqueness, right? It's a very rare thing to hear about a group that is kind of situated in schools, but is also outside of schools. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of what you guys do, I want to talk a little bit about sort of your background. It's never a good thing to start a podcast and just jump into it, right? You want to give people the idea of like who they're hearing from. Tell me a little bit about your background and how it is that you came to be the executive director over at Community and Schools. How are you sitting across from me today?
Great question. So I grew up in a family of educators. Mm-hmm. So for me, I was kind of immersed very early on in that space.
Right.
And I think really saw firsthand the power of education in creating opportunity.
Right.
So, fast forward, I go to college, don't have a super clear idea of what I'm going to do.
Happens to the best of us.
We've all been there. But I'd gotten really involved in college and volunteerism and worked with a lot of community groups and really didn't really realize that you could kind of translate that into a career. Mm-hmm. Who knew? And I had an advisor who said, I've seen the way that this sort of like sparks something in you.
Right.
Have you thought about Peace Corps? So I went home that night and I read everything I could and I applied the next day.
Okay.
Right. So there's the power of being a strong counselor for someone, right?
Absolutely.
So I spent 2.5 years in Guatemala working in community development.
Right.
And really got to see how when we support and empower a community, the change that can have.
Right.
And really decided that was for sure the career path for me. Yeah. So I went back to grad school and studied public administration and got a focus on nonprofit management. And, spent the next 10 years or so working in different nonprofits, working with community groups.
Okay.
Everything from early education to health to financial stability to the impact of tourism on communities, like all kinds of different things.
Right.
But I kept kind of coming back to education again because I really, really, truly believe if we invest in kids, that's how we drive change.
Absolutely.
And so I was really fortunate just over 5 years ago to have the opportunity to come to Communities and Schools at Chesterfield, and I was thrilled. It's a dream job.
Yeah. Now let's talk a little bit about community and schools in general. Before we dive like super deep, I want to get the like 35,000 foot view here because I think there's probably a lot of folks who are hearing some of those, hearing the name, hearing the idea for maybe the first time. Right. Maybe they're at a point maybe where they don't have kids in schools anymore. Maybe even when they did, this wasn't necessarily a program that they had heard about. Tell me a little bit about how, what you guys do, what Community Schools is all about. And also it's a pretty unique setup. How would you sort of describe your group and the work you guys do?
Yeah. So our mission really is to surround students with a community of support, empowering them to stay in school and achieve in life.
Right.
So we're a nonprofit, but as you said, we have this kind of unique model. We're a nonprofit the way probably a lot of organizations are that you're familiar with.
Right.
But we're embedded and we work directly within the schools. So we have site coordinators that are at the school they serve full-time implementing our model. And really what they're focused on is understanding the needs in that particular school building with those students and their families, and then bringing in particular programs and interventions and community resources to kind of connect with those kids.
Right.
So it is unique. We kind of get the best of both worlds.
And how long does it take typically for, your site coordinators, once they start at a school, how long does it take before, they get a sense of what their program is like? Because I can imagine each community, each school is a little bit different, that even if there are some through lines, that each one is just a little bit different and you're kind of tuning it a little bit to each community. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. So every May, we actually do a community needs process with each one of our schools. And so we do interviews and surveying with the students at that school, with families, with the staff at that school, and with communities, right around there that might support it.
Right.
And we talk a lot about what are the strengths and what are the challenges in the school.
Right.
And then our site coordinators build their support plan for the whole next year, kind of based on that.
Right.
And they're working in tandem with the principals, right? We want to make sure that everything that we're doing is aligned to the goals the principal has for their school too, because that's really critical that we're working together.
Right. For sure. Now, in terms, I think you said 23, is that right? 23 staff, 16 that are directly in schools.
Yeah, so the majority of our staff are so we serve in 13 high-need schools in Chesterfield County. We have 16 site coordinators who are there working, and the rest of our staff is supporting more collectively across the whole organization.
Gotcha.
But those 16 folks, they live and breathe what's happening at their school and in the neighborhoods around their school.
Right.
And so that's really where we see the impact. You know, we're working with 13,000 students.
Right. Now, you've got those staff, but then you've got a whole bunch of volunteers I know you also work with, right?
Yes.
And I would imagine that the stuff that the volunteers do is pretty varied. Talk to me a little bit about the volunteers.
Definitely, yeah. We've got folks who come in as mentors, as tutors. We have folks who show up for one-time events where something might be going on. We have groups that might sponsor, if we have a group of students who are focused on improving their attendance. And so we might have a group who says, we're going to sponsor the breakfast for all the case managed kids who meet that goal.
Right.
We have folks who come in and read with our students. We have lots of groups like to do sort of off-site opportunities like pack school supplies or snack kits.
Right.
And so we really try to create opportunities that are going to connect no matter what your time commitment, availability is, your, how much you want to be around kids or not around kids, at a school, at your house. We try to create opportunities for everybody.
That's cool. Now, in terms of CCP, I think this is one of those things. I run into this a lot with various topics, is that sometimes it's hard to really kind of translate to folks the ins and outs of a topic or the ins and outs of a situation. For example, here, I don't think a lot of folks really realize how large CCPS really is. And the number, because of the size of the student population, then the number of varied needs that are going to exist within that number. Can you give me a sense of who these students are that are in need of help from a group like yours?
Yeah, you're right. I think there's often a misunderstanding sort of what our community looks like, because it looks very different than it did 20 years ago.
And again, this goes back to specific communities, right? Because in one part of Chesterfield versus another part of Chesterfield, it can be very different.
Yeah.
But when you look at it as a whole,
right,
the school system and you guys have to, you got to be able to meet all the needs across that spectrum. That's a very wide group of kids.
And it's a huge school system. So there's a little over 64,000 students in Chesterfield County Public Schools. Right. And unfortunately, the reality is that nearly 40% of them are economically disadvantaged. So we're talking about 25,000 students who are coming to school every day with really tremendous barriers. Right. We know, kids from those challenging backgrounds are often coming in behind their peers in so many different areas, not to mention the barriers once they get to school that they're trying to overcome.
Right.
So I think that surprises people. We talk about 25,000 students in need, and the reality is that's, bigger than all of Richmond Public Schools. Wow. That's bigger than a lot of other full school systems.
Right. That's
just
crazy.
the amount of kids that we have in need.
And that really sort of illustrates, right? Because if you're talking about there are that many kids just out of the bigger pool, right? Who, and that by itself is bigger than an entire division for somebody else.
Right.
And then especially in a place like Richmond, which is, it's a capital city, Now, in terms of the specifics, now we're obviously you're not going to tell me, names and that kind of thing, but I'm just curious to kind of maybe give people a little bit of a view, right? Paint a picture, so to speak, of what type of situation a kid might be facing. So could you give me an example maybe of a student in their situation and how community schools would respond to their needs? What does that look like?
Yeah, I love to kind of paint a picture sort of the process of us beginning to work with them and then where we kind of hope they end up, right? And yeah, not a specific kid, but this is really I'll share a story that's kind of a very common scenario we see with our students, right? Okay. So let's say a teacher comes to our site coordinator and says, I have a student in my class, we'll call him Jay, and he's always been a strong student. He's never been a troublemaker. He's always been a good kid, shows up. The last couple months, he's been missing a lot of school. He's chronically absent.
Right.
And when he is there, he's kind of disengaged. Right. He's not really focused. Right. I can tell something's going on. He seems really distracted. So our site coordinator would jump into gear, start meeting with Jay, start building that relationship and building trust. Because I think that is what is really critical, right? Yeah. These aren't quick fixes. They're getting to know kids so that they have that trust and can open up.
Absolutely, for sure.
So over that time, Jay might share that his dad's incarcerated.
Okay.
And mom has recently started working a second job at night to try to take care of the family.
Right.
So Jay has a couple of younger siblings at home in the elementary school. Let's imagine he's in middle school.
Okay.
So, he might have a couple of kids at the elementary level that he's now responsible for getting off the bus, getting fed, having them do their homework, getting them to bed, kind of all that before he even starts to thinking about what he needs.
Right.
That's a pretty big responsibility for a kid like that.
And that's a big responsibility for adults.
For anyone, right?
And
as the parent of a 3-year-old, I would tell you, it is very difficult.
As a parent of a 9-year-old, it doesn't get much better.
There we go.
But no, that's a really good kind of point because, there are probably a lot of kids, just like, quote unquote Jay here, who are doing a lot more, that have a lot more on their plate than simply just going to school and being a kid.
Yep. And he's exhausted, right? I mean, we can all imagine Jay is exhausted.
Yeah.
So our site coordinator, once he kind of shares that, she immediately starts thinking about, okay, what do we need to wrap around this kid?
Right.
So I think the first thing she's going to tackle are those basic needs.
Right.
So she's going to be thinking about, all right, if mom's working a second job, obviously they're stressed, around money situations.
Right.
So what are we going to do? So she's contacting our different community partners that we work with and saying, can we get weekend food backpacks there?
Right.
Do we need winter clothes? Do we need school supplies? Do you have a bed to sleep in at night? Right. All of these kind of foundational basic needs elements, we're getting that taken care of. I think the next thing that she would do, if they hadn't already done this, would be connecting with mom and really starting to build a relationship with mom. It's really important at communities and schools that we are seen as a trusted partner, as an advocate.
Right.
We are never there to be the disciplinarian.
Right.
We're never there to be punitive.
Exactly. Shake your finger, that kind of thing. Right.
Everything we're doing is saying, hey, we're noticing that this is a challenge. How do we work with you to solve it?
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
So working with mom and maybe realizing or starting to brainstorm what other supports could come in place. Is it some workforce development skills so that maybe she could get a higher paying job and doesn't need to work a second? Is it figuring out after school care for those younger kiddos? What does that look like? Building that relationship with her. So then, let's assume that those kiddos at the elementary are at another CIS school.
Right.
Our site coordinator would also be connecting with that site coordinator and saying, hey, you might have Jay's siblings, these two kiddos on your caseload.
Right.
Maybe they've gotten on the radar yet, but maybe not. Maybe there haven't been some red flags yet for those kids. Right. So how do we get in front of that?
Right.
How do we connect those resources?
Makes sense. Yeah.
And make sure everything's really coordinated. So we're not duplicating in some ways, but missing other key gaps. Right. So once we kind of get through those initial things, we're starting to think hierarchy of needs. Then we're getting to kind of that next level.
Right.
So, we know that Jay's dad is incarcerated. So what are we thinking about with that? So it might be matching him with a mentor.
Right.
Finding a positive male role model who's going to come every week and spend lunch with him. Right. Help him see that there's, somebody out there who's rooting for him, who's a champion for him.
Yeah.
Building that. It might also be that site coordinator, one of the things they do is run small groups. So she might have a small group with 5 or 6 kids who have an incarcerated parent.
Yeah.
And they're meeting together and starting to see how they can build that peer support with each other. Right. What resources exist for each other. And then I think we move to kind of the next step. Now that we've gotten all that handled, how do we get Jay re-engaged in school?
Yeah.
So, first we're doing some remediation. We might be working with those teachers saying, hey, maybe he's been behind these last couple months. What do we need to do? What does he need to do?
Right.
To get back on track.
Yeah.
Helping to be a little bit of that, I don't want to say go between, but help kind of communicate, between those two, the student and the teacher that, hey, can we help drive this forward? Right. So some of that remediation, but then, we heard at the beginning that teacher said he had been really engaged. He was a smart kid.
Right.
So how do we reignite that passion?
Right.
How do we reconnect him? Is he interested in a particular area where we might have a volunteer that we know has that career and we could connect them so he gets excited about it? Does he meet one of those goals we talk about? So he gets to go on an enrichment trip to the science museum and he wants to be an astronaut. So that's amazing to go, really helping him, get back to that point.
Right.
So, I think as I kind of close this scenario, I'll say that this work is really hard and it is not, they're not quick fixes usually.
Yeah.
But, in a scenario like this, we would hope that through that ongoing support, that at the end of the year, Jay is coming to school regularly. There's a relationship not just with him, but his mom, so that we're getting ahead of any other potential challenges that come down the road.
Right.
And that he's back engaged and excited about learning.
Yeah.
And that would be kind of the goal we would get to with that kid.
As you were kind of describing it there, it feels like what you guys do is almost like this really intricate merger between education and almost like social services,
Yeah.
right? Where it's like the two are there's never one that's sort of leading versus the other. They're sort of in tandem
They're so connected
at all points. And I think what's really interesting is that, what you're just describing there is, that's one of the benefits of you guys being embedded in schools, right? This is not a scenario where somebody just comes after school and, they're a handful of kids and you hang out for an hour or hour and a half, and then everybody goes about their way and then, you see them next week.
Yep.
This is on the ground, in the rooms, in the buildings, working with these kids all the time.
Yep.
And that's it feels like that's what it takes. And I can imagine from your point of view, you would say that that's exactly what it takes in order to affect change.
It is exactly what it takes. I was speaking to a group of fourth graders a couple weeks ago on a career day. And I was trying to describe what I do, which, unless you have a very tangible job, it's hard.
Are you telling me you practiced this
I practiced on fourth graders.
Thanks a lot.
They're actually the best people to practice on, because if they don't get it, most people aren't going to, right? And I was talking to them and I said, think about when you come to school, what makes it hard for you to learn, right? Did you not have breakfast? Did you get in a fight with your mom that night?
Right.
Are you stressed about a test? And you could apply that same logic to any adult going to work, anything,
sure.
right? Like the things that can make it hard to do your job, your work, are usually not really the work itself.
Right. Yeah.
It's all these other factors that are in play. So for me, at Communities and Schools, if we can work with the staff in schools, with families to remove those barriers, then our kids can learn.
Yeah.
It's I don't want to say it's simple, because it's not simple.
It's a simple idea, but it's a complex solution.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of that solution, this is a fairly important year for you guys. Your organization is going now into its 30th year.
Yes.
I can understand that any anniversary is big, but 30 for something like this feels pretty substantial.
Yeah.
Now, my understanding is that you guys were one of the first ones of these in the Commonwealth, or was the first one?
Yeah, very first one in Virginia. So I didn't really say this at the beginning, but CIS is part of a national network around the whole country.
Right.
But every affiliate operates totally independently, for their community.
Right.
But we were, the first affiliate in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, that's great.
So.
And so basically everybody else just copied you.
Exactly.
But I know over the past 5 years or so that there's been, it's basically been a really important sort of stretch for you guys. So even I can imagine in terms of the 30th, it would be important no matter what, but especially because of the last 5 years that you've had. Tell me what you've got planned for the 30th anniversary this year, and what kind of events you have coming up throughout 2024.
Yeah, that is a big one. And to speak to that kind of last 5 years, we've really made a commitment, our staff and our board saying, as the need has been rising in Chesterfield, we've got to grow to meet that need.
Right.
We can't sit back and serve quietly in a couple of schools. We have to do this in a bigger way.
Right.
So we've really been, in this very intentional space. When I came in 5 years ago, we were in 6 schools.
Right.
And we're now in 13. So, we're getting there.
Right.
Lots more schools to be in, but
but
that makes
you've
this
dealt,
year
but
big.
I don't want you to buzz past that because 6 to 13. Okay, if you had $6 now you have 13, but that's doubling the number of schools you're in, and that's double. Imagine like it's exponential because it's not just the kids that you impact directly. There's the kids around them. They're the families, and that's a whole bunch of community. So I don't want you to buzz right past that because that's a fairly substantial. It's not just one. It's double. It's 100% plus more.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah. It's been busy.
So,
but luckily for our 30th, we have a lot of ways to celebrate.
I was going to say.
So we kind of decided, rather than just have one big event, we're trying to do things all year, right? It's just like your own birthday. You want that more than a day. You're trying to stretch that month or whatever, right?
All April long.
Exactly. So we have had things the last few months, and we have things through the remainder of the year, and we've tried to look at them as, how do we volunteer connected to 30th?
Right.
How do we advocate for 30th? How do we donate for 30th? How do we celebrate, right? Like kind of putting a label a little bit to all those ways to get engaged.
Right.
So I'll highlight maybe 3 opportunities that are going to be coming up in spring.
I like how you looked up at me like I was, is that okay?
I feel like you're going to like this.
We're
3.
good. Yes,
okay.
Let's do it.
So the first one is kind of around advocacy and learning more, I would say. So March 1st, we're doing a CIS bus tour. And it's a small group of people. We literally get on a yellow school bus and we go to 3 of our sites, and you meet our site coordinators. We usually have a couple of our kids speak.
Okay.
And you really get to see the work up close and personal.
Great.
And I think, I can talk about this all day, but to really go and see it,
right.
It's hard to not be 1,000% in this mission when you see it.
Yeah.
So that's the first one. The second is that throughout all of April, we're going to be doing, we call it All Site Volunteer Month.
Okay.
So we have a volunteer project at every one of our 13 schools.
Okay.
And we've got some that are manual labor, some that are working with kids, some that are things you can do from your office. We create a lot of different ways, again, for people to engage. But that month is really cool, and I think it's neat because people can come on their own and volunteer and meet new people and have that experience.
Right.
Or they can kind of adopt a project and get their friends or their coworkers to kind of take over a whole project at a school.
Cool.
So that's really neat. And then the third one is really a celebration. So on April 13th, we are throwing a big old party. So
people love parties.
People love parties. And this one's going to be very cool. I'm really excited about it. It's called Game Night Gala.
Okay.
And it's kind of an elevated, fancy game night. But the idea is feel like a kid again. So we're going to have games and music and food. And it's going to be an incredible night. But really, we know how critical play is for kids, but play is critical for adults too.
All of us. Yeah.
So that'll be April 13th. And all three of those, as well as other opportunities, are on our website. So CISofChesterfield.org.
Okay.
And folks can sign up or buy tickets or, whatever the certain event is. So it's going to be a really good year.
Good deal. Now, before I get you out of here, I got one more question. I was just thinking, you said that there are 13,000 kids in Chesterfield, and yet that you're serving, right? Mm-hmm. But you've got like 25 or so that are economically disadvantaged. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned just a minute ago, you want to, how do we grow it? How do we keep growing it? How do you grow that number of students? How do you go, you went from 6 to 13. How do you get from 13 to more? What needs to happen for you guys to have even more of an impact here?
Yeah. I think the first thing is understanding. So opportunities to come here and share with a big audience is exciting. I am always up for talking to any group and sharing, but I think we rely on people who know and people who are learning to also spread that word, right? Share that statistic about need. Talk about communities and schools and what that is, because I think until people know the need and know that we're there trying to solve some of these challenges, we can't grow.
Right.
The second thing is donating.
Yeah.
That's the reality. We're a nonprofit. We rely on contributions from, companies and individuals and businesses and foundations to do this work.
Right.
I think it's pretty cool though, the investment and what that return on investment looks like.
Right.
So there was a 5-year national study done on the return on investment of communities and schools. And they found that for every $1 of CIS investment, $11.60 of economic benefits created.
Okay.
When you're thinking about if that kid graduates high school,
I got you.
What does their trajectory look like versus a kid who dropped out?
Right. Yeah.
So it's a pretty good investment.
Yeah.
And then lastly, give of your time and talent, whether that's getting your group of friends or your civic group to come in on something, volunteer, get engaged, host a supply drive, attend an event, any of those ways. I think that's how we drive change and get to more schools and serve more kids.
Good deal. Well, Ashley, thank you very much for coming on the podcast, talking to us about communities and schools. Congratulations on 30 years, and we'll hopefully catch up with you down the road when you make that number go from 6 to 13 to, 20 or something.
Exactly. We'll do it.
Appreciate you coming on. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Now, make sure you check us out on social media. On Twitter, it's at Chesterfield VA, and on Instagram, it's Chesterfield Virginia, all one word. And on Facebook, you can check out our podcast page. Just search Chesterfield Behind the Mic. Now, make sure to follow or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Overcast, or wherever it is that you get your shows. And if you're so inclined to give us a rating or review, we'd very much appreciate it. As always, a video version of the show is available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website, Chesterfield.gov/podcast. That's also where you can submit feedback anytime, make suggestions, or just reach out to us. You can also watch the show on WCCT Thursday through Sunday at 7, on the weekends at noon. That's Comcast Channel 98 and Verizon Channel 28. And lastly, you can check out Chesterfield.gov/connect with us to find a number of other ways to connect with Chesterfield County. My thanks to my director, Martin Stith, my executive producer, Teresa, Bonifas, and all the good folks from Constituent and Media Services. And my thanks to you for joining us today. So, from all of us here in Chesterfield, thanks again for making us part of your day. We'll see you again real soon. Take good care. From blogs to podcasts, newsletters to alerts, social media, the latest community news, our Connect With Us webpage has you covered. Chesterfield.gov/connect with us, your source for all things Chesterfield.